Title: What Women Face at Grand Valley Institution, Ontario, Canada's federal prison for women. Help this channel grow. Like the video, leave a comment, subscribe, and don't forget to turn on your notifications for our next real-life prison stories. This helps us a lot. Thank you. The story begins. The Broken Promise. January 1997. A new women's prison opened in Ontario. White picket fences. Cottages instead of cells. A promise that this time would be different. 29 years later, Indigenous women represent over half the population. Ashley Smith died in segregation at 19. The promise failed. Ashley Smith, the death that exposed everything. Ashley Smith was 15 years old when she threw crab apples at a postal worker. 30 days in youth custody. That should have been the end of her story. Instead, it became the beginning of a 4-year journey through Canada's correctional system that would end with her death at 19 inside Grand Valley Institution for Women. Ashley had serious untreated mental health issues. In custody, she acted out. Each incident led to new charges. More time. More isolation. The system didn't know how to help her, so it punished her instead. By the time she arrived in federal custody at 18, Ashley had been diagnosed with multiple psychiatric conditions including borderline personality disorder, depression, and psychosis. Self-harm was constant. She would tie ligatures around her neck, not to kill herself initially, but to get attention, to force staff to intervene, to feel something other than the crushing loneliness of isolation. In her last 11 months alive, Ashley was transferred 17 times across 4 provinces between 8 different institutions. 17 transfers in 11 months. That's a new prison every 20 days on average. She spent most of that time in segregation, alone 23 hours a day with minimal human contact. The constant transfers weren't helping her. They were making her condition worse. But the Correctional Service of Canada didn't know what else to do with a young woman who kept harming herself in ways that forced them to intervene. On October 16, 2007, while at Grand Valley Institution in Kitchener, Ontario, Ashley requested to be transferred to a psychiatric facility where she could receive proper mental health treatment. Instead, she was placed on formal suicide watch in segregation. 3 days later, on October 19, at approximately 7:50 in the morning, Ashley tied a ligature around her neck in her segregation cell. Guards stood outside her cell and watched. They had been ordered by senior management not to enter her cell as long as she was still breathing. This wasn't a miscommunication. It was official policy. Staff had been instructed that because Ashley frequently tied ligatures for attention, they should not respond immediately. They should wait until she lost consciousness to determine if the attempt was serious. The guards watched through the cell window for approximately 10 minutes while Ashley strangled herself. Video footage later released during the inquest shows them standing in the corridor, looking in, doing nothing. By the time they finally entered the cell and cut the ligature, it was too late. Ashley was rushed to Grand River Hospital in Kitchener. She was pronounced dead at 8:10 in the morning. She was 19 years old. 3 guards and a supervisor were initially charged with criminal negligence causing death. The charges were later dropped. The warden and deputy warden of Grand Valley were fired. The warden was quietly rehired by the Correctional Service of Canada less than a year later into a different position. Ashley's mother, Coralie Smith, fought for years to have the truth exposed. The Correctional Service of Canada spent millions of dollars in legal fees trying to prevent a coroner's inquest from going forward. But video footage of Ashley's final months showing her being pepper-sprayed while restrained, forcibly injected with sedatives, held in full-body shackles during transfers, and moved constantly between institutions was eventually made public. The footage shocked Canadians who saw what had been happening behind prison walls. The inquest began in September 2012. It lasted over a year. The jury heard testimony from more than 100 witnesses and reviewed 8,000 documents. On December 19, 2013, they returned their verdict: homicide. Ashley Smith's death was ruled a homicide, not murder, but a death caused by the actions and inactions of others. It was the first time in Canadian history that a coroner's jury had ruled an in-custody death a homicide when the death wasn't caused by another inmate. The jury made 104 recommendations to prevent another Ashley Smith. Recommendations covering everything from mental health screening at intake to limits on the use of segregation to mandatory psychiatric transfers for seriously mentally ill prisoners. The Correctional Service of Canada officially accepted the recommendations in principle. It's now 2026, 12 years later. Most of those recommendations still haven't been fully implemented. And women with serious mental illness continue to be held at Grand Valley Institution in conditions that mental health professionals say are inappropriate and dangerous. The Indigenous pipeline, from residential schools to prison cells. In April 2022, a disturbing milestone was reached in Canada's federal prison system. For the first time in history, exactly half of all federally incarcerated women were Indigenous. 298 out of 596 women. By 2024, that number had crossed 50%. Today, in 2026, more than 1 in 2 federally sentenced women in Canada are Indigenous. At Grand Valley Institution specifically, as of 2023, 36% of the population is Indigenous. Think about what that means. Indigenous people make up roughly 5% of Canada's population, but they represent over half of women in federal prisons. In Ontario, where Indigenous people make up less than 3% of the population, they represent over 1/3 of the women at Grand Valley. Indigenous women in Canada are 15.4 times more likely to be incarcerated than non-Indigenous women. Not 50% more likely. Not twice as likely. 15 times more likely. This isn't an accident. It's not a statistical anomaly. It's the direct result of over 150 years of colonial policy designed to destroy Indigenous communities. Between 1876 and 1996, the Canadian government operated a system of residential schools where Indigenous children were forcibly removed from their families. They were sent to institutions run by churches where they were punished for speaking their languages, practicing their cultures, or maintaining any connection to their Indigenous identity. The stated goal was cultural genocide. Kill the Indian in the child, as the saying went. At least 150,000 children passed through these schools. Thousands died from disease, malnutrition, and abuse. Those who survived carried trauma that echoed through generations. Residential schools officially ended in 1996. But the systems that replaced them, child welfare agencies, youth detention centers, and adult prisons, function in remarkably similar ways. They remove Indigenous people from their communities. They separate families. They punish cultural connection. And they perpetuate cycles of trauma. Here's how the pipeline works. Indigenous children are apprehended by child welfare services at rates far higher than non-Indigenous children. They are placed in foster care, often with non-Indigenous families far from their communities. They lose connection to their culture, their language, their identity. Studies show that children who spend time in foster care are significantly more likely to become involved in the justice system, not because they are more prone to criminal behavior, but because the trauma of family separation and cultural disconnection creates conditions that lead to conflict with authority. By the time Indigenous girls reach adolescence, they are dealing with compounding trauma. Many have experienced violence, physical or sexual or both. Many struggle with addiction, often as a way to cope with unresolved pain. Many end up on the streets where poverty and lack of support push them into survival crimes like theft or prostitution. And then they enter the justice system where the discrimination continues at every level. Indigenous women are more likely to be denied bail. They are more likely to be sentenced to custody rather than given community-based alternatives. They are more likely to be classified at higher security levels once in prison. And they are less likely to be granted parole. At every decision point in the system, bias works against them. By the time an Indigenous woman arrives at Grand Valley Institution, she's not just dealing with whatever crime brought her there. She's carrying intergenerational trauma from residential schools. She's dealing with the loss of family, culture, and community. She's coping with mental health issues that were never properly addressed. And the system's response is isolation, punishment, and more trauma. Now, you might think that Grand Valley, built with the philosophy of creating choices and explicitly designed to be different from the brutal institutions that came before, would be better equipped to handle this. You'd be wrong. The Correctional Service of Canada has programs theoretically designed for Indigenous women, healing lodges, access to elders, cultural ceremonies. On paper, these things exist. In practice, access is limited. The few healing lodges that exist have long waiting lists. Many Indigenous women at Grand Valley spend years without meaningful connection to their culture. Security classifications often prevent participation in cultural programs. And the shortage of Indigenous staff means cultural supports are inconsistent at best. Here's a specific example. The mother-child program at Grand Valley allows eligible women to keep their children with them while incarcerated. The program exists in part to break the cycle of intergenerational trauma, to prevent Indigenous children from being separated from their mothers and entering the same child welfare pipeline. Since the program began in 1998, 28 years ago, a total of 21 mothers have participated. 21 mothers in 28 years. From 2018 to 2024 alone, only 7 mothers were enrolled. A 2025 audit found that the program suffers from insufficient governance, inconsistent infrastructure, and untracked services. Translation: it exists on paper, but barely functions. The system: why reform always fails. On December 19, 2013, a coroner's jury delivered 104 recommendations to prevent another Ashley Smith. Comprehensive, detailed reforms covering everything from mental health screening to staff training to the use of segregation. It's now 2026, 12 years later. The Correctional Service of Canada won't give a clear answer on how many have been fully implemented. In their official response, they use phrases like accepted in principle, work in progress, and under review, which is bureaucratic language for we haven't actually done it. This is the pattern with Grand Valley and with Canada's correctional system generally. Crisis happens. Investigation follows. Report is released. Recommendations are made. The government promises change. Nothing fundamental changes. Another crisis happens. The cycle repeats. Let me show you why. First, understand what Grand Valley costs. As of 2024, housing a single woman at Grand Valley costs approximately $250,000 per year. That's federal funding, money that could be spent on mental health treatment, addiction services, housing support, or any of the things that might actually prevent women from ending up in prison in the first place. But once a woman is in the system, that money goes to maintaining the institution. Salaries for over 200 staff members, security infrastructure, buildings and grounds, the bureaucracy itself. The Correctional Service of Canada has a vested interest in maintaining the system as it is. Closing a prison means job losses, budget cuts, reduced institutional power. The union representing correctional officers, the Union of Canadian Correctional Officers, has fought against every major reform proposal. Their argument is always the same: public safety. Any change that reduces the prison population, limits the use of segregation, or transfers mentally ill inmates to hospitals is framed as dangerous. They have significant political influence. They donate to political campaigns. They lobby members of parliament. And they use fear very effectively. Meanwhile, the women actually in the system have almost no political power. They can't vote while incarcerated. Their families are often poor, marginalized, dealing with their own crises. And the general public doesn't want to think about what happens behind prison walls. So reform becomes politically difficult. There's organized resistance to change. There's no organized constituency demanding it. And politicians can safely ignore the issue. But there's a second, deeper problem. The people running Grand Valley genuinely believe they're doing important work. They see themselves as professionals managing dangerous situations. When something goes wrong, they don't see systemic failure. They see individual incidents. Ashley Smith isn't evidence that the system is broken. She's an outlier, an exceptionally difficult case that even the best system couldn't have saved. Except she wasn't an outlier. Since Ashley Smith's death in 2007, multiple women have died at Grand Valley. The exact number isn't publicly available because the Correctional Service doesn't publish comprehensive mortality data. But we know from Office of the Correctional Investigator reports that deaths continue. Preventable deaths. We know that self-harm incidents remain frequent. Use of force interventions involving women with mental illness are common. Segregation, despite being officially abolished, continues under different names like structured intervention units. The mental health crisis documented in Ashley Smith's case hasn't been solved. An October 2025 report from the Correctional Investigator made that clear. The Correctional Service of Canada is fundamentally ill-equipped to provide adequate mental health care. Which brings us to the third problem. The women who end up at Grand Valley are the women Canadian society has already failed multiple times. Most have experienced violence, childhood abuse, sexual assault. Most struggle with addiction. Most have mental health conditions that were never properly treated. Many are Indigenous women carrying intergenerational trauma. They don't need a prison. They need comprehensive, long-term, trauma-informed care. They need housing. They need addiction treatment. They need connection to community and culture. But those services are expensive. They're complex. They take years to show results. And they require addressing the root causes of crime, poverty, racism, the legacy of residential schools, which is politically and socially difficult. It's easier to build a prison. So we have Grand Valley, a facility designed with good intentions but fundamentally limited by the fact that it's still a prison. You can make the housing units look like cottages. You can remove the barbed wire from the fences, and then put it back when people escape. You can offer programs, education, mental health support. But at the end of the day, the core function is containment. Women are there against their will, separated from their communities, under constant surveillance and control. And containment doesn't heal trauma. It often makes it worse. Here's what would actually need to change. 1. Most of the women at Grand Valley shouldn't be there at all. They should be in community-based treatment programs with proper mental health and addiction support. 2. For the small number who do need to be separated from society, the facility should be therapeutic, not punitive, run by health professionals, not correctional officers. 3. The billions spent on incarceration should be redirected to prevention. But none of that will happen because it would require dismantling systems that powerful institutions depend on. And so we continue. The Indigenous incarceration rate keeps rising. The mental health crisis continues. The mother-child program barely functions. Women die preventable deaths. Reports are written. Inquests are held. Recommendations are made. Some get accepted in principle. Nothing fundamental has changed.